I'm very grateful to have Nicholas being our speaker this year. We've had a number of sort of distinguished speakers over the years from a variety of Christian traditions, our own, and the Anglican tradition and the Catholic tradition, the Orthodox, other Orthodox churches as well. So we obviously to represent that ecumenical spirit that we have. Some years ago, I first met Nicholas because he decided he was going to form Eastern Christian links, which he felt was very important, that Christians in the West should know more about the Christians in the East. And I mean, that's particularly relevant now when we see such terrible things happening, particularly in Syria, and the plight of Christians, which is so often neglected by people. So it was a very important thing to establish this, to have friendly links and so people get to know each other and understand the spiritual life of the other communities. It was a great pleasure to travel with Nicholas into Turkey and visit the Syrian monasteries and Armenian sites, and we were in Istanbul together. I actually went on an Eastern Christian links to South India with some other of our friends without Nicholas, because he couldn't make it that time, but we still went under the auspices of this very worthy sort of umbrella organisation which he'd formed and which we felt was very valuable. So I'm going to ask Nicholas now to speak to us. We're very pleased to have you, Nicholas. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abba Seraphim, for those kind words of introduction. As far as the weather's concerned, as far as I'm concerned, it is very much waistcoat weather, whatever the calendar may be. But I hope it will be reasonably nice and warm in here for you. Perhaps I should make it clear that I am not a theologian, I am not a church historian, I am a person from the pew. And so the thoughts that I would like to present to you come from that perspective. But nonetheless, I offer them to you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. I was surprised and most grateful to Abba Seraphim when he invited me to give the address for this service, but at the same time far from sure that I had the necessary qualifications for such a task. My feelings of inadequacy were only heightened when he most helpfully sent me the list of speakers at this service in earlier years, all of whom were patently far better equipped and qualified than I for fulfilling the role. Then a certain panic set in, when I began to reflect on what I might say that could be could remotely be of interest to you all. For I realised that for all of my Christian life, I had never made any attempt to take part in the week for prayer of prayer for Christian unity. Having spent my formative years at a school in the evangelical Anglican tradition, to which the then Bishop of Norwich, Maurice Wood, sent his sons, and later in the Christian Union movement of what was then the IVF, I've been carefully tutored to view the World Council of Churches as either, at best, an irrelevance, or at worst, a papal plot for world domination. But I'm also aware that episcopal invitations are not to be lightly treated, and so I've attempted to honour the invitation, and I hope the result is not too inadequate for the occasion. Given that the words Christian and unity have historically very often not been close companions, it seemed to me that we should first ask the question, how did it come about that there is any need to consider unity among Christians? How did it come about that how is it that those who claim to be disciples of Jesus Christ, and doubtless very familiar with St. John's Gospel chapter 17, come to be so divided? The historical record of the attitude of church leaders towards those who differ from them theologically makes at times painful reading. Two tendencies can be discerned. First, the tendency for theological dispute to trigger splits or schisms and to spawn separate churches, each tending to deny the other to be the true church. The second, perhaps more worrying and difficult to explain, let alone justify, is a trend towards levels of abuse, persecution, and even brutality towards those on the other side of a theological dispute. Christianity has a history of violence being perpetrated amongst those who claim to be its adherents, and I'm not including here attitudes to Judaism or Islam, that is shocking. Not just to us as Christians today, but perhaps more seriously to ordinary people with no meaningful church connection, and whom we may wish to draw into our fellowship as disciples of Jesus Christ. Things have been done in the past which today would see those responsible put on trial in The Hague for crimes against humanity. Clearly, this is not the place for a detailed study of heresy and schism, but looking at a few examples from the earliest Christian centuries may be instructive, as it is then that the pattern of attitudes to theological deviancy developed. As the gospel spread in the first centuries, it quickly met different languages, from Aramaic to Greek, Syriac, Latin, Coptic, and later Armenian and Georgian, to name but the main ones. This inevitably gave rise to problems in translation and potential differences of meaning. But perhaps strangely, there's no serious record of strife within the Christian churches in these years based purely on linguistic or indeed ethnic or political lines. As the gospel spread east and north of Palestine, it spilled over the often fluctuating boundary of the Roman Empire, with the groupings of Christian converts in separate political entities, which later became independent churches, for example in Persia, Armenia, and Georgia. But they see themselves as parts of one universal church. They are not at loggerheads with one another, despite the rival political ambitions of the ruling elites, who may or may not have accepted Christianity. And even when the Armenian church splits from communion with Rome and Constantinople in the mid-6th century, it does so because of the theological disputes arising from the Council of Chalcedon a century earlier, and not because of politics or language. Christian leaders in the earliest centuries produced a huge quantity of written material, a great deal of which has come down to us. A lot is devoted to combating the views of others with which the writers disagree. Through this process, the fundamentals of our faith were established and defended. Much is careful, detailed theological argument, sometimes forcefully presented, but other, more dubious techniques soon become evident, aimed at the person rather than the ideas. At a whiff of heresy, pens begin to be dipped not in ink, but vitriol, and the consequences of condemnation as a heretic become, as the centuries roll on, ever heavier. Thus Tertullian, who died around 225 AD, and who wrote a series of tracts and books against a variety of heretical views, begins the first chapter of his first book against Marcion by describing as most disagreeable the geography and climate around the Black Sea, and attributing some revolting practices to the barbarian inhabitants, only to conclude, nothing, however, in Pontus is so barbarous and sad as the fact that Marcion was born there, fouler than any Scythian. That's perhaps an interesting way of engaging the sympathy of your reader, but it's neither logical nor objective. Some, of course, were content with merely condemning the person's ideas. Thus, St. Anthony, whose icon we have with us on the wall, in his letters refers to Arius, the early 4th century deacon and later presbyter at Alexandria, who famously argued that Jesus Christ did not share the same attributes as God the Father, and was not therefore equal to him. And Anthony comments as follows: As for Arius, he spoke strange words about the only begotten. To him who has no beginning, he gave a beginning. That man has begun a great task, an unhealable wound. If he had known himself, his tongue would not have spoken about what he did not know. It is, however, manifest that he did not know himself. They are remarkable for their restraint and lack of abuse. The intellectual put-down is simple but devastating. If Arius does not understand himself, how on earth can he be expected to understand anything else? Eusebius, when he describes the doctrinal deviations of a man called Paul of Samosata, the 3rd century bishop of Antioch, takes matters a little further by linking his heresy to a deviant lifestyle, which is set out in detail, but as proof of the error of his doctrines. When dealing with the Manichees, he said they are demonic, manic, and infecting the world with a dangerous poison. But the penalties and consequences are mild. Excommunication. The deviant is declared ejected and simply thrown out of the community. But Eusebius gives an important detail, and one prefiguring a closer involvement of some churches with the political authorities, which in turn would coincide with penalties for theological deviancy, increasing markedly. When Paul of Samosata refused to leave his church building, Christians appealed to the civil authority in the form of the Emperor Aurelian, around 270, who is praised by Eusebius for ordering him out. The possibility of seeking and using secular orders with state penalties for non-compliance to enforce the rulings of councils or bishops was clearly approved by some at least within the Church of the Roman Empire, decades before Constantine's involvement with it. For it is with Constantine that the boundaries of church and state become blurred. When Arius loses the argument at Nicaea in 325, not only does he lose his membership of the Alexandrian Church and his ecclesiastical position, but he suffers an imperial punishment, banishment, albeit for only 2 years till he persuades a further session of the council and the emperor that he should be allowed back. Under Theodosius I, in the late 4th century, the state is now enshrining in law which form of Christian theology is the correct one, in this case the formula agreed at Nicaea, and providing state penalties for heretics. The Edict of Salonica in 380 states, "They will suffer in the first place the chastisement of the divine condemnation, and in the second, the punishment of our authority, which in accordance with the will of heaven, we shall decide to inflict." The full meaning of this was confirmed with the execution of a man called Priscillian in Trier in 385. But while it no doubt seemed good at the time, this imperial attempt at forced unity was to disintegrate in the next century. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the theological arguments, and for the present purposes are not taking sides, the councils of Ephesus in 431 and Chalcedon in 451 were a disaster in terms of Christian unity. They spawned a whole batch of new heretics, all duly condemned by imperial edict, deprived of their ecclesiastical positions within the Roman Empire, and harassed so that they tended to edge eastwards, beyond the reach of the authorities in Constantinople, and even finding sanctuary in the Persian Empire. By the time we get to the early 7th century, attitudes towards heresy have found their way into stories, circulating among ordinary Christians, and particularly the monks and the ascetics. Some of you will know William Dalrymple's book, From the Holy Mountain, in which he follows the journey of 2 monks, John Moskos and one called Sophronius, who was later to become Patriarch of Jerusalem at the time of the Arab conquest. The journey that they took through Syria, Palestine and Egypt around the year 600. On their travels they recorded the stories they heard from the holy men they met. Thus in one story a monk is shown a dark, disagreeable place with a fire in which he sees, amongst others, Nestorius, Eutyches, Arius, Severus, Origen, all regarded in Rome and Constantinople at this stage as responsible for particularly bad heresies. The man is told, "This place is prepared for heretics, for if a man practice every virtue and yet not glorify God correctly, to this place he will come." In another, one brother is told in a dream that another brother has been having sex with a tavern keeper's wife. When he asks the other brother about this, he of course denies it firmly. They talk, and it transpires that the other brother had had communion in a church holding to Severus's doctrines, and the explanation for the dream becomes clear. Consorting with heretics is akin to illicit sex, for Severus had been a tavern keeper before becoming Patriarch of Antioch. And so we find heretics not just excommunicated and persecuted, but lampooned, demonized, worthy of the worst that hell can do, and woven into moral tales, rather like the big bad wolf, for the edification of younger Christians. At this point, however, it is perhaps worth noting that the Greek word hieresis, originally meant choice, and was the process by which a young person was expected to examine different philosophies to see which he felt was the best guide for his or her future life. It had more to do with conduct than belief, religious or otherwise. Of course, I'm not suggesting that bishops and other church leaders do not have a duty to teach the doctrines of the faith correctly and ensure that theological ideas that damage its essentials are opposed. They do. It's their most important function. But to state that begs immediately the fundamental question: what is an essential theological doctrine? And that, of course, has been the problem down the centuries. But with all humility and some trepidation, I'm going to offer a tentative answer. For having looked at some attitudes towards theological deviancy in the earlier Christian centuries, which essentially repeats itself successively through the later history of Western Europe, I wondered whether there was anything that emerged in that period that may help us to see beyond what divides churches today. For we have inherited the divisions of the past. We did not create them. In pondering this, I found myself asking what is perhaps an unusual question. What is it, in the eyes of those who look at those of us who claim to be Christians from the outside, that in their view separates us off from the devotees of other religions or those who have none? It is, of course, the doctrine of the Trinity and the status that we accord to Jesus Christ. That status comes from the position that we believe he has in relation to God. We believe he shares all the attributes of divinity with God, that he is God, but in a fully human form. That simple belief is the principal cause of persecution by outsiders against Christians down the ages. The early church struggled and argued with this concept for centuries, and it's the cause of the schisms in the 5th century over the councils at Ephesus and Chalcedon. But there's one event that appears to me to have been remarkably successful in terms of the subsequent acceptance of its theological decisions, and that is the meeting of church leaders held in the summer of the year 325 in the town in the west of Turkey called Iznik, famous for its porcelain tiles in Ottoman times. In 2006, my wife was teaching in Bursa, which is a town on the Silk Road and a short ferry crossing and then a bus ride south from Istanbul. A signpost to the left as you travel south indicates the road to Iznik, and one day I took it. It's a beautifully quiet, sunny day in June, and I followed the road through the countryside from 2 lines of low hills with a placid blue lake dividing them, until I came to the end of the lake and the town, still girded by its double line of walls and with its aqueduct still remarkably well preserved, for it had been part of the town's water supply, I understand, until the 20th century. For Iznik is not a Turkish town, but the ancient Greek polis of Nicaea, and it was to this beautifully situated place that the amazed bishops of the Christian Church found themselves invited by the Emperor Constantine to attend a conference, an invitation perhaps even less to be resisted than an episcopal one. It matters little whether there were about 250 bishops, which seems historically more likely who attended, or the 318 of Orthodox tradition, though interestingly Bede gives the same number. In fact, with each bishop being allowed to bring additional priests and deacons, the total number of attendees was probably closer to 2,000. It must have seemed like an invasion to local residents, never mind the emperor and his entourage. But it was the breadth geographically that they represented that is important, coming from within and outside the Roman Empire, a point Eusebius is keen to make, recording the presence of a Persian bishop too, and even a Scythian, which is tantamount to saying even a barbarian, so not much has changed since Tertullian's day, it seems. They were representatives of the entire Christian community, a global church transcending political boundaries. Eusebius, in fact, draws an interesting parallel with Acts chapter 2, from the groups listed there as being present at the first Pentecost. The summit communique at the end of the several weeks of deliberations was commendably short. Jesus is fully divine, fully God, nothing less. Taking a baptismal creed in use in one of the dioceses, those few but famous words were inserted into its second paragraph to create what became the gateway to the church. Assent to Nicaea and you're in. Do not do so and you are out. It's a decision that has stuck and never seriously been contested since. It was expressly accepted by the Protestant reformers. It's the basic tenet of all Protestant theologies, Episcopalian and nonconformist. It's a basic tenet, of course, of all Orthodox churches, Eastern, Oriental, and the Church of the East, as it is, of course, of the Roman Catholic Church. Further, it was effectively reissued in the year 381 at a council held in Constantinople, the council of the so-called 150, a figure also mentioned by Bede, when additional words were added to the third paragraph concerning the equality and work of the Holy Spirit, to create what in the West is called the Nicene Creed, but more accurately, but more of a mouthful, in the Orthodox churches as the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. I have, of course, not overlooked a certain 8-letter Latin word that was to appear in the West in the later text of the third paragraph. What should one do about filioque? Clearly, it's a problem, but not one that, in my view, is particularly important. It is perfectly clear that it is a later addition, and by only one of the patriarchal churches, that in Rome, and not part of the original text. Secondly, to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son is not to deny that he proceeds from the Father. The word alone is not there in the original creed. It was not an issue that the Protestant reformers considered, as they had rather more important problems with the then Roman Catholic Church with which to deal. To revert to the original text in the West would not deny a double procession, but merely not assert it as part of this creed. It becomes a matter for theological discussion and resolution at a later date in a different place, with both sides being able for the present to keep their own interpretation. For my part, I am happy to accept the original, and I've decided that I will not repeat that phrase when we read the creed in the Anglican communion service that I attend. Sadly, in Nicaea today, the building in which the council sat is no more, though the church in which a later council sat does still exist as a shell. But the grid of streets is much the same as then, and to wander round the walls or along the shore of the lake is undoubtedly to walk in the footsteps of those bishops of old as they took time out from their deliberations. Rarely visited, it should be a place of pilgrimage for every Christian church. The importance of Nicaea from the point of view of the 21st century, which is inevitably the one we must adopt, since we cannot undo the historical fact of the splits and schisms that have occurred subsequently, is that it does not impose a unifying concept. It reveals one. We only have to see and acknowledge this unifying belief that we already have. We do not have to create anything. No new committee, no new forms of words. When the evangelical pastor preaches that Jesus is fully God and fully human, when the Orthodox monk confesses to the faith of the 318 of Nicaea, they mean precisely the same thing, though both would probably be very surprised to be told so. Instead of treating it as an ancient text repeated in some liturgies of some churches, why do we not bring it to the forefront and acknowledge it as something that already exists as the basis of that essential unity for which Jesus prayed in Gethsemane? For it is without question one of the greatest Christian texts, arguably the most influential one in the history of Christianity since the Apostolic era, of which we should be supremely proud to be the inheritors. It's part of the problem, dare one say, that we're all rather frightened of moving out from our accepted forms of Christian belief and worship. Should we not have the courage to accept all of those who acknowledge Jesus as fully God and fully human, in whatever form of words they may choose to use, as Christians, even if their additional beliefs or forms of worship may be difficult or perhaps even impossible for us to accept. But Nicaea has the potential to be even more revolutionary. It not only reveals the basic propositions that unite Christians, it also opens the door to that which is, for many Western Christians, a world of churches and historical figures of which they have never heard, religious practices of which they may be suspicious, and forms of worship they do not understand, but which nonetheless is our priceless heritage. There will then dawn the deeply unsettling realization that Christianity is not a product of Western European religious thought and experience, but that it came to us from further east. Whilst we in Britain have all heard of St. Patrick and St. David, St. Columba and Iona, and are aware of what is called Celtic Christianity, their connection with Eastern Christianity, and especially Egypt, is only recently coming to light with new research. Our knowledge of the early history of Christianity in our island comes largely from Bede, writing around 730. He doesn't mention these figures, and is clearly writing from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, solidly loyal to the Church of the West, i.e. Rome. This has left many with a false understanding that Christianity in Britain has foundations not much earlier than the late 6th and 7th centuries, with the coming of Augustine in 597 and the Synod of Whitby in 664. But Bede does record in detail an interesting synodical letter, written after a synod held at Hatfield in the year 680, over which one, Theodore, Archbishop of the island of Britain and the city of Canterbury, presided, and at which the venerable bishops of the island of Britain, having the most holy Gospels before us, hereby unite to proclaim the true and orthodox faith. The synod then formally endorsed the 5 ecumenical councils that had sat by that date. Bede wants to make it clear that his church is utterly loyal to and theologically part of a worldwide church which extends, he says, into Africa, Asia, Egypt and Greece. I fear that too many in Europe and the West still see Christianity through the prism of the splendid Gothic churches and wealthy monasteries of the Roman Catholicism of the Middle Ages, or its 16th century Protestant offshoots. The reality is that it was formed largely in caves and deserts, in central Turkey, Egypt and Syria, with most of its bishops in cities east of Istanbul. How many churchgoers in Europe, I wonder, know of the church based in Baghdad, which had a geographical area of successful missionary operations from India via the Turks of Central Asia to China? There's a whole history of Christianity of which Western Christians are appallingly ignorant, and resurrecting Nicaea will bring us face to face with it. But it will, I'm afraid, get worse for our comfort zone. Not only will we be visiting perhaps our local libraries and asking for some rather strangely titled history books, but the current news bulletin should hit us rather differently. With the Arab world in repeated chaos, the mention of Christian churches in the Middle East will reveal to our new understanding not the Western imports of the imperial past, but the continuous Christian traditions rooted in the apostolic era and still functioning today, and sometimes using church buildings erected in the 4th century. We will find we have Christian brothers and sisters in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Jordan, never mind in Israel, Lebanon, and of course in Egypt. Men and women who are Christians by reason of accepting the faith of Nicaea. What is our Christian duty towards them? Within what was the Ottoman Empire, Christian minorities survived, due to the millet system, remarkably intact until the 20th century, despite being second-class citizens and periodic bouts of persecution. But the devastation of the last 100 years has been terrible, in percentage terms greater than any point in the earlier ages, with Greek, Armenian, Syrian and Chaldean Christian populations being reduced to a tiny fraction of what was the case a century ago. Iraq and Syria became strongholds for the remnants, until, that is, the last 10 years, which have seen first Iraq and now Syria implode with Islamic civil wars, and the Arab Spring produce a rather chilly one for Christians in Egypt. I repeat, what is our Christian duty towards these our brothers and sisters? What action should we be taking? What should our church leaders be doing? For surely we have a precedent. As you'll recall the comments in various New Testament passages about the financial contributions collected in various culturally superior and wealthier Greek churches for the relief of their ethnically different but still fellow Christians in and around Jerusalem, following political upheaval. The point is, they did it. Or do we find our old arguments about popery, or the validity of clerical orders in Western churches, or new ones about women priests or homosexuality more exciting, or simply more comfortable? The idyllic calm of Nicaea and its beautiful surroundings will open the door to a bleaker, more dangerous place. But we have no excuse to refuse to go there, for not to do so will leave us ignorant of who we really are, and surely bring upon us the condemnation that the great St. Anthony visited upon Arius, that I mentioned a little earlier. If he had known himself, his tongue would not have spoken about what he did not know. It is, however, manifest that he did not know himself. As we cannot know ourselves until we know our Christian past, what, I wonder, is the worth of our present ideas about our religion? Finally, may I end with two quotations that I find particularly instructive on divisions within and among churches. The first is from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, the final edition being published in 1559, in which he makes the following trenchant criticism of those who lightly divide the body of Christ. For the Lord esteems the communion of his church so highly that he counts as a traitor and apostate from Christianity anyone who arrogantly leaves any Christian society, provided it cherishes the true ministry of word and sacraments. Christ has chosen and set apart the church as his bride, nor can any more atrocious crime be conceived than for us by sacrilegious disloyalty to violate the marriage that the only begotten Son of God has deigned to contract with us. This principle extends to the point that we must not reject a church so long as it retains the true ministry of word and sacraments, even if it swarms with many faults. We claim too much for ourselves if we dare withdraw from the communion of the church just because the morals of all do not meet our standard, or even square with the profession of Christian faith. Trenchant comment, you may think. The Institutes are a great read, but they're not for the faint-hearted. The second is from John Moskos, whom I mentioned earlier. He quotes a short comment from a man from Alexandria, and we only know his name, Palladius. Believe me, children, heresies and schisms have done nothing for the Holy Church, except to make us love God and each other very much less than before.